Association of their online events, which are being held online at leechess.org. My name is Sean Press. I run these events on behalf of this association and produce a summary of the event, normally the day after. And the event we're looking at today is the ACTCA Thursday Standard. It is a long time control event, played with 40 minutes plus second increment per move, and it is 1 round a night, going for 5 weeks up until Christmas. And last week I looked at the game by Tim Pearce, and I'm looking at another game by Tim Pearce today. He's doing quite well in the event, another win. And this is a slightly longer game, but it's one that I'm going to cover because it's got, as usual, lots of interesting things in it. So let's get across to the game. I must apologise in advance. I have a system that this stream and replay I'm just seeing frames being dropped. We're going through here. I am going to blame my virus scanner because, as with most computers, you end up with very intrusive virus scanners that take over when you're not paying attention. But let's see what we can hopefully do our best here. So e4, e5. Notice I've flipped the board around because Tim was black. He was playing Graham Saint, and we're playing a Grand Prix attack in the Sicilian. And this is the other thing I play more than anything in this opening. I played this opening a lot when I was younger because it didn't give me the promising positions that I used to get. There's some antidotes for black which deal with some of the main lines here. So g6, e6 straight away can be played as well, even a6, knight f3. These are all good choices. Knight f3, bishop g7. And bishop c4 is the original main line in this. The idea is that assisted by plans like castling, playing queen e1, playing f5 at the right moment. But eventually black came up with a very simple antidote of just playing e6 and d5 at the right time. So much so that bishop b5 is now considered the stronger move. You can still play this opening, but you've now got to kind of play it more with the bishop b5 lines. And if black plays d6, for example, you do get d4 in because of the pin, and you're transposing back into main line Sicilians with the couple of little extra moves here and there, or some extra space with f4. But why people play the Grand Prix attack as white is because they don't want to play mainline Sicilian. So there is a tendency for black to get a slight advantage because white won't actually play the absolute best move, which is normally d4 at the right time. 6. That also once the bishop on c4 here was that there would be some attacking ideas based on this as well, but with the pawn on e6 it's much harder to achieve. Instead, if you play d6, there's been a lot of crushing wins for white in this line. Castle, we play e6. I think Fischer famously had played f5 here, but in a reversed English setup, which was then copied by white. And d3, knight here. You play queen e8, e1, sorry, and then you're looking at this plan of playing the queen to h5, playing the knight to g5, playing f5, and all the pieces suddenly go crashing in on the king's side. But sadly, those days are beyond us because it turned out that black worked out what was going on and developed better defensive ideas. So, where are we up to here? Castles. Now, for some reason, when I was checking the analysis of this game, knight b5 was suggested, but I think this is ridiculous. Pawn to d6, pawn to d3, then you play a6, and you've just given black lots of free moves in this position. So instead, knight ge7, and the idea is to support again this d5 push. Queen e1, following up the plan that I mentioned before, castled. d3 seems to make more sense to me in this position because at least f5 frees the bishop on c1. The bishop hop back to b3, which I think is a little bit slow. Maybe worried about a6, b5, but which black kind of threatened with a6 here. But an immediate d5 is fine. And there are two choices here. One, takes and takes. And black is, I think, better in this position. The two white square pieces that I've circled in red are well and truly out of play for now. And black has a lot more space. Or white could just play d3 here to protect the c4 square as well. But again, the position is at least equal. And black's got nothing to fear here. a6, a4 to try and deal with the threat of b5. So b6 was played. By the way, d5 can almost be played at any point here for black. And I think it's really important as you get stronger at chess that you, instead of looking at sort of non-aggressive moves like a6, b6, etc., you start trying to play the aggressive moves like d5 or dynamic, as we want to call them, because not only you'll find you do get better results, but it also sharpens your chess. The more sort of combat that you've got to practice with, the stronger you'll be. So d3, bishop b7, and so it's just a bit of development. Notice that black played d5 now, and I suspect black finally chose to play d5 here, not for any dynamic considerations, but simply because it was now threatening d4. The risk with waiting until you get very favourable conditions for playing certain moves in chess is you may never get those conditions. It's better just to play them early. So d5. And the bishop just retreated back to c1, and I've given it a question mark because if you're going to play a move and then panic about why you played the move, you need to do a bit more thinking in advance. Bishop went to f2 is the other option here. Queen d7, bishop h4, knight d4. And black is developing a small advantage in this position, but nothing too great. I think bishop c1 gives black a bigger advantage. Takes and takes. Knight to d4. But having said that, I think one of the issues here was that black decided that they were going to start exchanging pieces. And traditionally, if you've got more space, right, you should avoid exchanges because your opponent remains cramped. I can see black's logic here of exchanging pieces, that white has been threatening to go on some sort of king hunt or hack for most of the game. So as a defensive idea, taking the pieces off the board is good. But at the same time, if black had probably been more aware of that their position was getting better, they might have kept some more pieces on the board. So we play knight takes, pawn takes. And we're going to see a reasonably good example of where this goes. So black actually is better in this position. You can't play knight e2 here because you just drop the pawn on e4. So you're kind of forced to grovel back with knight d1. And knight c6 is, I think, the right move here. You bring the knight back into the game. You leave the pawn on d4 for now because it's cramping white's position. The e3 square and the c3 square are out of bounds, which means that those pieces that are huddled on the back rank have fewer squares to go to. Instead, black came up with sort of a combinational exchange, but the exchanges really only help white. So the first move is d3. So you're already sort of going, well, I'm giving up control of c3 and e3. I'm playing d3. If the pawn takes, sure, I get to take with my queen, and it's a nice aggressive square. But if you play knight c3 here, what happens? Knight goes back, for example. We take and we take, and sure, we've kind of, well, we had a really strong pawn on d4, and then we've just swapped it off for the pawn on c2. And sure, the queen has now got onto d3, but by itself, it's probably not doing an awful lot. So ultimately, this isn't helping black in any way, shape, or form. What did help black slightly was c3, okay, but then black continued up with their kind of, I'm just going to start trying to eliminate some things. So d2, bishop takes d2, because now you play bishop takes e4. And queen takes and queen takes, and the queen's in on d2. But after rook f2, the position is completely equal. And I think what's happened here is black had a good position, possibly didn't know how good it was, and then exchanged off the one thing that made the position good, which was that strong pawn on d4. It would have been better just to support that pawn and see what happens. So now it's back to getting towards an ending. Queen c5. The knight on e3 might be a little bit of a problem, simply because it's on the same diagonal as the king. Rook over, rook over, rook over. And both sides seem content just to swap pieces off, not give their opponent too many chances, but at the same time, not take too many chances themselves. Normally, two things happen here, and this is very common at club chess, by the way. Below about 1800, this happens a lot, where you just kind of go, I'm going to play mistake-free chess, but I'm not going to play aggressive chess either. I'm just going to just keep moving the pieces and we'll see what turns up. And it's almost just a waiting game to see who makes the blunder. It will get you to a certain level at chess, and a lot of my chess is like this. Going beyond that involves a bit more, I wouldn't say risk-taking, but understanding when you can take risks and when you don't need to. So knight f5, king comes up to protect the knight because it can't move because of the pin. We play h5. So black is actually starting to look for a bit of space here, which is not a bad idea. But again, it's risk-free space here. Knight goes back, hits the queen. Now, queen b4 might have been the right idea here, because if we take and we take, knight e4, rook d3, it's not clear how we're necessarily going to break through in this position. The b2 pawn goes, but black has plenty of, has one simple response after bishop takes b2, and that is knight c4. And then you're forking the bishop on b2 and the pawn on b6. And so you're looking at just recovering the pawn straight away. Queen f3 was played, and then b5 wasn't a bad move. Because if you take if you take here, queen takes b5 forks the bishop on b3 and the king on e2. So moves like this can actually solve two problems. One, you kind of set a trap that you're assuming your opponent won't fall for, but at the same time, you get to play b5, which is a move you wanted to play anyway. And previously you go, well, I can't play it because it gets captured. Oh, wait, now if it gets captured, it's still good for me. So a5 was played in response. But black again had to be a bit dynamic and followed up with b4 here. b4, and there's a very long line I'm going to give at this point. Normally with the long lines, I give them because they're kind of forcing, which means that they're basically checks and captures for about 10 moves. It's easier to calculate these ones than moves that lines that don't have checks and captures in them. But nonetheless, unless you've been practicing really hard on your calculation skills, you're not going to calculate this one over the board that well either. Otherwise, you wouldn't be 1800, you might be 2200 or 2300. So we check here, king goes back, and we take. And we're threatening the bishop. So the knight goes back to attack the queen, and the queen on f3 covers the bishop. You play queen b8, but black has managed to gain a lot of space here, and the white pawns are a little bit more ragged than the black ones, which means that the bishop on g7 is threatening to take on b2. So you play, even if you play knight d4 to block this, you can kind of get a favourable ending after these moves here, where you simply play, you do swap stuff off with check, but you take the pawn here on a5. And the point is that you're currently a pawn up, which is not always enough to win a game of chess, but the pieces are a little bit better placed. Surprisingly, the h5 move, which I said for space earlier on, actually turns out to be really good here because it makes sure that the knight is nice and safe on f5 for the moment. And although white could then try and swap it off for the bishop, the knight can always move off to a dark square, which the bishop can't. So this is considered better for black, but there'd be a lot of play before this one was converted. Instead, knight c4 was played here. Again, we're still swapping things off because after bishop takes. In fact, white has not only come back into the game, but white is actually a little bit better here. Queen e4, and then a couple of pawns got captured for both sides. Knight c4 is fine here, but in fact, queen takes c4 is just as good. And again, black is trying to keep the position safe by offering exchanges. But these exchanges aren't necessarily helping black, because I think the b pawn, which I've circled in red, is kind of the most at-risk piece on the board now, because it's not supported by anything. Although in black's favour, the bishop on g7 is usually better in positions like this than the knight, simply because there are pawns on both sides of the board. And playing endings with bishop and rook, okay, do take some talent. I think Bobby Fischer was particularly good at playing these endings of bishop and rook versus rook and knight. But for this game, I'm not sure that was the consideration. So rook goes to d7, on principle a good move. You're looking at playing rook b7 to try and take the b pawn. So the rook goes to b8. You could just simply liquidate, or try and liquidate the pawn straight away, because after b4, c takes b4, you can either take on b2 straight away with the bishop, or you can play rook to b8 first. And in both circumstances, both those pawns are now at risk. And again, b4 is one of these dynamic moves that eventually you sort of learn to play as you've seen enough chess. So rook b8, straight across. Knight goes back here to stop the pawn moving up. Okay, bishop to f6. So we're doing a bit of maneuvering here. Knight goes to a dark square in front of the pawn. King up, king to e3, g5. Psychologically, g5 is actually a really good move. Practically, it's nothing great. The reason I say it psychologically is because f takes, bishop take, king f3 on the one hand is fine for white, except white might have been worried about the fact that the e-pawn is now passed and that the e-pawn can run up the board. Also, you can play knight d3 with the same idea, okay, of creating a passed e-pawn. Now, that in and of itself isn't a worry, except it does look worrying. And I think what ended up happening was that white decided not to take when they probably should have, because now they play g3 instead, which is a little bit passive. Pawn up, king to e4. h4 is a good move here. Knight drops into c6 to hit the rook, so the rook comes up and attacks. The knight comes across to e5 and checks. And black just swapped the knight, pawn takes, and now we get to a rook and pawn ending. These are sometimes tricky to play, and this one I wouldn't say was super tricky, but at the same time, the result of the game did shift a few times in here. So we take and we take. And what's happened here after that sequence of moves is essentially black has got the kind of better of the pawn structure now. White has, under the rule of what we call pawn islands, 3 pawn islands. b2, c3 is 1. Pawn on e5 is 2. Pawn on g3 is 3. Black only has 2, which is this set of pawns on the king side, plus the b pawn. Noting that the pawn on f7, or the pawn on, it's more the pawn on g5 is harder to defend, because the pawn on f7, if it moves to f6, will just get captured. So it's the pawn structure slightly favours black, but it turns out that this arrangement of pawns becomes much more significant later, and you'll see why. So the rook goes to b8, kind of marking time. g4 looks good in principle because it's keeping the king out of any squares. This turns out to be a bit fatal later, of course. Rook over. So both players are now just playing moves, is one way of putting it. Just to keep an eye on seeing whether their opponent makes a mistake. And at this point, I think white makes the first kind of really big mistake in the ending. Plays king d4. King e4 was fine, because if you play rook check here, we just play rook back. And in fact, black's got to be careful of about swapping into some endings which blow up in their face, because the white king might be able to come across. If the rooks come off, the white king might be able to come across and grab the b pawn quickly. King d4 was the blunder, because after rook check here, king d3 picked up a pawn there. So suddenly we're winning a pawn. But rook b7 looks like it's winning it back. It's very hard to defend the pawn, and maybe this is what white was planning for. Rook g3, and now I'm going to give you a couple of long lines here, not to put you to sleep, but simply to show you some ideas that then turned up in the main game. But because they could have happened earlier, I'm starting earlier. So king e4 turned out to be the next mistake. Instead, king d4, and then b4, and you'll see why in a second. So if we play c takes b4, we play rook check here, and we play king c3, it turns out this is still a tricky ending for both sides. Black is going to try and run the g pawn down the board. White is going to try and run the b pawns down the board. But instead of if taking this way, you took with the rook, we get something very similar to what happened in the game, which is rook check, king up here, rook takes, c takes, and we get a race, and we start racing the pawns. But it turns out that black wins the race, not because black started in front, because in this position black queens with check. And because black queens with check, which is really crucial in pawn races, if you can queen with check, it's often the saving idea. It means that white has to waste a move with the king and can't queen straight away. So this is a really good idea, especially if you've never seen endings like this before, or you're new to these sort of endings. That in pawn races, see if you can calculate whether you queen with check. But you've still got to deal with the fact that white is going to queen this pawn. So normally what will happen in endings that look like this, and I will show you why in a second, what we actually do is we don't care about having that queen on g1, except as a way of swapping it for the queen that is to come. So we go queen g2 check, king to c7, take on b2, let our opponent queen, take on d5 with check, king moves, and we just take the queens off the board. And after here, we're now going to get another queen. So often in pawn races like this, we do see the situation where both sides queen, and then one side with an extra couple of moves will capture a couple more pawns and then happily take the queens off the board. So in a sense, you're queening a pawn just so you can swap it for the other queen. But that's specific to endings where it's basically a pawn race, where you're just chasing each other down the board. It does happen later. King e4 was actually worse because b4 got played again. And if we play c takes b4 in this position, we've got rook to b3, getting in behind the passed pawn, b5, g4, and we're starting to race. Rook b8, king g7 is important here to stop the rook coming to the g file. Rook here, we take here. Rook goes here, for example, just to stop the pawn from going to g3. We check. King goes back, have another pawn. King goes across here to try and round that pawn up. We check again. King goes back here, and then we just play rook here. And basically, black is going to be winning this ending. You've still got to know how to win it, but black is certainly going to be winning this ending with the 2 extra pawns and the more active rook. Rook takes b4 looked okay, but it turned out to be the big miscalc here because, and I think black had actually worked all this out by now. It certainly looked the way how quickly they played their remaining moves. So what they're transposing into is a completely winning king and pawn ending. We go rook check here. Again, something like king d3 might have been the better idea, but it still ends up in the same kind of rook takes, pawn takes, king f5, good move. King here to protect the pawn. Don't care, I'm going to push. And if we have the race, we get that same situation of black's pawn will queen with check. And then the queen will get across and stop the white pawn from queening. And if we start to run back with the king, which is kind of looked like it was going to happen in the game, king over, king goes there, and we just march across here. And what black is going to do is try and win the 2 queenside pawns. And sure, black can get across and try and wrap up the kingside pawns, but you'll see the final trick. So king here, we take up, king goes to f4, we take one of the pawns, king goes to e5, black takes the second pawn. And if king goes to f6, the problem now in this position is you can't take the f7 pawn. The moment you take the f7 pawn, the pawn on e6 just goes to e5, and the slow king, only moving 1 square, can never catch it from behind. So this is the ending that black was either expecting or figured that, well, that's one of the things that could happen here. Instead, the king went to f3, but it ended the same way. The argument here, of course, is that the king will stay on the king side a little bit quicker to stop the pawns from queening, but after taking and here, b5 takes here, the same thing happens. The black king is fast enough to get across and stop both those pawns on the b file from queening, while the white king can only take the g5 pawn and get to f6, but can never take the f7 pawn. And here we go. So king over. And in fact, at this point, white resigned because they saw how this was all going to turn out at this point. So it was a long game, but essentially there were 2 main themes in this game. One was both players were kind of happy to exchange material to keep the position safe. I'm not even going to say equal, I'm going to say safe, so that there were no spectacular risks in there. But then right at the end, it was just a little bit of better play from black to kind of convert this ending. But I will say that the failure to take on g5, for example, here was one of the things that might have affected white's result here. If white had taken that pawn, certainly would have been a different ending, but what happened there might not have been so catastrophic. So, a long game. How long have I been going for? About 25 minutes. That's one of my longer broadcasts that I've done over the last couple of years doing this, but it was a game worth looking at there. So my name is Sean Press. I run these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association, produce these summaries, and they go up on Twitch, normally about 10 a.m. the following day, which is Fridays at the moment. I also then do upload them to YouTube if you want to look at them much later. So thanks for tuning in, and until next week, I'll be seeing you later.